This is Ben. I'm going to complete day 26 of Wes Boss's JavaScript 30, and today's activity is to use JavaScript and CSS to programmatically update the background of a drop-down menu, and that looks like this. So you hover over a link in the drop-down menu, and then there's going to be this background that appears along with the content of that link. And what's happening is, if we look at the HTML first, I have this sort of background element which just sort of hangs out, and then when I hover over one of those list items, which you see here in my nav bar, that background element is then going to hover behind it and appear as a background. And each side of one of these list items is going to be some child element. It's not always necessarily a div with a class of dropdown, and that's how, when we look at the JavaScript, I'm going to access the content of that one specific list item. So in the JavaScript, I grab the elements that I'm going to need, including all of those list items in the nav bar. And to those list items, I'm going to add a couple of event listeners, one which will trigger when the mouse enters and one will trigger when the mouse leaves. When the mouse leaves, this handle leave function is invoked, and handle leave removes these classes which I'm going to add to those elements. So it's handle enter where I'm going to add the classes, and a lot of this work takes place. So the first step is to add CSS classes to this. This is what is listening for the event. In this case, it's going to be whatever list item I'm hovering over. So I'll say this.classList, and we're going to add to it a class of triggerEnter. And I'm going to add a second class called triggerEnterActive, and that's because if we look at CSS here, I am hiding the dropdown with opacity 0 and display none. And then when I change to display block and opacity 1 to display the content in the background, I can't do that in one step. I have to actually do it in two steps. That's why I've created two separate classes. But I also want this transition to run, so I'm going to do this next part of the JavaScript inside of a setTimeout function. So we'll say setTimeout, and then we'll create a function to run, and then it's going to run every 150 seconds. And I'm going to do two things at once. First, I need to check that there actually is a class of triggerEnter. That's because with my handle leave, I'm actually removing triggerEnter and triggerEnterActive at the same time. So I need to check that there is indeed triggerEnter before we add triggerEnterActive. Man, say all of that 5 times fast. And it's not just this.classList, it's this.classList.contains. And then we'll use double ampersands, which is a form of the ternary operator, and it will only return this next part if the first part is true. So now we're going to say triggerEnterActive. Cool, so now I have 2 of the 3 classes that I need to add. The third class is one that I'm going to add to the background, and it's called open. So again, we'll access its class list, we'll add to it, and then at this point we have the navbar content will display, and so will that background element, but that background element will not be lined up where it should be. So let's make that right. So let's get the content of the one particular list item that is listening for the event. So I'll say const, and we'll call this dropdown, and that's equal to this, whatever list item is currently listening for the event, .query selector, and this is where I'm going to grab whatever child element happens to have the class name dropdown of that particular list item. Next, I'm going to grab the coordinates of the drop-down background and the navbar. So I'll say const, we'll call this drop-down chords. And we're going to say drop-down, and then get bounding client rect. It's hard for me to memorize that one. Get bounding client rect. I'm going to copy and paste that because we're going to use that method one more time, but for the navbar, const nav chords is equal to nav dot paste. Why am I doing that? Well, it's because the navbar might not be at the very top of the screen. So to make a long story short, I'm going to create my own object of coordinates. That way the background element properly locates itself behind the list item. And really the only thing you have to do is with top and left is do a little bit of math. Once we have our own object of coordinates, I can apply those coordinates to the background CSS by doing background style set property and then setting the width, the height, and then adding this transform property using the coordinates that I have created. So barring any mistakes, we should be up and running. Let's go over here, let's refresh, and there we go. Cool, it's a fun activity. I think this is a neat feature. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you tomorrow.